Evelyn never expected that taking a nanny job for a millionaire's children would change her life forever. Alexander Knight, rich, powerful, and emotionally distant, was a man who had locked his heart away. But as their worlds collided, a buried secret and an undeniable attraction would test the limits of fate itself. A woman with a broken past, Evelyn Carter, stood outside the towering gates of the Knight mansion, gripping her worn leather bag tightly. The cold wind brushed against her cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside her heart. She had been through too much, too many losses, too many heartbreaks. Yet here she was, about to step into the life of a man who had everything she had lost. Her heart pounded as she pressed the intercom button. A robotic voice responded. "State your name and purpose." Evelyn took a deep breath. "This is your fresh start," she reminded herself. Evelyn Carter. I'm here for the nanny interview." The gates buzzed open, and she stepped inside, her breath hitching at the sight of the mansion. It was grand, too grand. The perfectly manicured gardens, the marble fountains, the enormous glass windows, reflecting the sky. It felt like a world she didn't belong to, but she had no choice. She needed this job. A well-dressed butler led her inside, and her eyes widened at the luxurious interior. Chandeliers glittered above, and soft classical music played in the background. Yet, despite all the grandeur, the house felt cold, lifeless, as if something was missing. Meeting the millionaire, a man who had it all, yet nothing. Evelyn was ushered into a large study, where a tall, commanding figure stood by the window, his back to her. "Sit," he said without turning around. His voice was deep, authoritative, yet void of warmth. She obeyed, her hands clenched in her lap. Finally he turned. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Alexander Knight was devastatingly handsome, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes that held secrets, and dark hair that looked effortlessly perfect. But his expression was unreadable, his gaze calculating, as if assessing whether she was worth his time. "You applied for the nanny position," he stated rather than asked. "Yes, Mr. Knight," she replied, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. He narrowed his eyes. "I've read your resume. It's lacking." She swallowed hard. Of course it was. She didn't have years of formal training. She didn't come from an elite background. But she had something more, something that couldn't be put on paper. "I may not have a degree in childcare, Mr. Knight," she admitted. "But I understand children. I know what it means to feel lost, to need someone to care." For a fleeting second, something flashed in his eyes. Pain, recognition, but it was gone in an instant. "Why do you want this job?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. How could she tell him the truth, that she was running from her past, from her grief, from the hole in her heart that had never healed? "Because I need it," she said simply. Alexander stared at her, as if trying to see beyond her words. "My children are my priority, Miss Carter," he finally said. "They have been through enough. I won't allow just anyone into their lives. If you mess up, you're out. Understood?" Evelyn nodded. "Understood? 1 month trial," he said, standing. "We'll see if you last." He walked past her, and just for a second, the faint scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something intoxicating, brushed against her senses. It was the first hint of warmth she had felt in this house, and she hated that it came from him. Meeting the children, the broken souls he couldn't heal. Evelyn was led to the playroom, where 2 children sat in silence. Emma, the 6-year-old, clutched a stuffed bunny, her big brown eyes wary and uncertain. Liam, 9, sat stiffly, staring at the window, lost in thought. There was no laughter, no playfulness, just emptiness. Evelyn's heart ached. "Hi," she said softly, kneeling before them. "I'm Evelyn." Emma's grip on her bunny tightened. Liam didn't even turn his head. "You don't have to talk to me," she continued gently. "But if you ever feel like it, I'd love to listen." Emma glanced at her, then at Liam, before whispering, "Do you like stories?" Evelyn smiled. "I love them." Emma's eyes lit up, just a little. "Mommy used to tell us bedtime stories," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's chest tightened. "Mommy used to. I could tell you one tonight if you'd like." she offered. Emma hesitated, then nodded. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. Liam, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed outside. I miss her, Emma whispered, her little voice cracking. Evelyn reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind the girl's ear. I know, sweetheart, she murmured. But she's still with you, in your heart. Emma leaned into her touch, and Evelyn felt something shift. The ice was melting, just a little. The first night, a glimpse of vulnerability. That evening, Evelyn was settling into her small but elegant guest room when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, his hands in his pockets. Emma asked if you could read her a bedtime story, he said, his voice gruff. Evelyn blinked. She did? He nodded, looking almost conflicted. She hasn't asked for that in months. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The tension was palpable, charged with something unspoken. I'll read to her, Evelyn finally said. Alexander's gaze flickered to her lips, so fast she thought she imagined it. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. A new beginning, or a dangerous distraction. That night, as Evelyn sat by Emma's bedside, reading a fairy tale, she could feel a pair of blue eyes watching her from the doorway. Alexander stood there, his expression unreadable, his fingers pressed against the doorframe. For the first time in a long time, his house didn't feel so cold. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt something stir inside her heart, something she wasn't ready to face, something dangerously close to attraction. A tense morning, a battle of wills. The sun barely peeked through the massive glass windows of the night mansion, as Evelyn made her way to the dining hall. The silence in the house was suffocating. Unlike other homes filled with laughter in the mornings, this one felt frozen. She found Emma and Liam seated at the long polished dining table, their small hands barely reaching the edges of the massive mahogany surface. Plates of untouched food sat in front of them, perfectly cooked eggs, fresh fruit, and toast that remained untouched. Alexander was there too, sipping his coffee, his sharp blue eyes scanning his tablet. He didn't even glance up when she entered. Good morning, Evelyn greeted softly, her voice gentle yet firm. Emma gave her a small smile, but Liam kept his eyes down, poking at his food without interest. Evelyn could feel the weight of the children's loneliness pressing down on her. They weren't just quiet, they were used to being unheard. Did you both sleep well? She asked, taking a seat beside Emma. Emma nodded shyly, while Liam just shrugged. Evelyn's gaze flickered toward Alexander. He was unreadable as always, his chiseled features betraying nothing, but she could feel the tension radiating off him, like a man carrying an unbearable burden. You should eat something, she said, addressing Liam this time. It'll give you energy for the day. Liam finally lifted his gaze, sharp, guarded, too old for his years. I don't need energy, I just need Mom back. The words hit like a dagger. The room fell into silence. Alexander's grip on his coffee mug tightened, and for a brief second, Evelyn saw something crack in his icy exterior. Liam, he said, his voice low but firm. Liam pushed his plate away and stood up. I'm not hungry. Without another word, he left the room, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the mansion. Evelyn's heart ached as she watched him leave. Emma's lower lip trembled, and she looked up at Evelyn. Will he be okay? She whispered. Evelyn reached out, smoothing Emma's hair. He will. He just needs time. Alexander finally spoke, his voice clipped. Don't get too attached. Evelyn turned to him, frowning. They're children, Mr. Knight, not business transactions. For the first time, his gaze fully met hers. There was something electric in the air, a clash of wills, a challenge neither wanted to back down from. His blue eyes darkened, and for a moment she felt trapped in them, like he was looking into her soul, trying to read the secrets she hid. They're my children, he said, his voice dangerously soft, and I know what's best for them. Evelyn didn't blink, then start acting like it. A flicker of something, anger, admiration, or both crossed his face. She had challenged him, and Alexander Knight was not a man used to being challenged. A broken boy, and a softening heart. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found Liam, sitting by the window in the library, staring outside. She hesitated before approaching him. "Can I sit with you?" He didn't respond, but he didn't push her away either. She took that as a yes. Evelyn settled beside him, watching as he traced patterns on the glass. "Did your mom ever sit with you like this?" she asked softly. Liam's jaw tensed, his fingers pausing for just a moment before he nodded. "She used to read to me and Emma. She always said stories made people feel less alone." His voice was quiet, guarded. Evelyn smiled gently. She was right. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was softer, fragile, like a thin layer of ice beginning to melt. "You don't have to talk to me, Liam," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you ever want to, I'll be here." For the first time, Liam turned to her, his brown eyes full of sadness. "Do you promise?" Evelyn's heart clenched. "I promise." A moment that shouldn't have happened. That evening, Evelyn found herself in the mansion's grand library, scanning the shelves for a book to read to Emma. The warm glow of the chandelier above cast golden light over the towering bookshelves. She reached for a book on the top shelf, standing on her tiptoes, when a strong arm reached past her, effortlessly grabbing it. The scent of sandalwood and spice filled her senses, and she stiffened. "Alexander, you should ask for help," he murmured, handing her the book. Evelyn took it, but her fingers accidentally brushed his. A spark shot up her arm, unexpected and unwanted. She swallowed hard, trying to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. "I don't like relying on people," she admitted, looking up at him. His expression shifted, just a fraction. "Neither do I." For a moment they just stood there too close, the air between them heavy with something unspoken. Evelyn could feel her pulse racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was her boss, and she was just the nanny. But then his gaze dropped to her lips. For just a second, and that second was long enough. Her breath hitched. Alexander's jaw tightened, as if he was fighting something within himself. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing there, her heart pounding against her ribs. The walls are crumbling. Evelyn lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for him, but she had seen something in his eyes tonight. Something raw, something vulnerable, something real, and that terrified her. Because if she wasn't careful, she might just start falling for a man who had everything except love. And worse, she had a secret that could shatter everything. A moment of laughter in a lonely home. The next morning, the night mansion felt different, warmer even if just slightly. Evelyn had spent the entire night thinking about Alexander, about the way his eyes had lingered on her, about the walls he had built so high around himself that even his own children couldn't reach him. She had to remind herself, he was her boss. Pushing those thoughts aside, she focused on Emma and Liam. If she couldn't break through to Alexander, she would at least do what she came here for, help his children heal. "All right, troops," she said dramatically as she set plates of pancakes in front of them. "Today's mission is Operation Pancake." Emma giggled, clapping her little hands. "What's that?" Evelyn leaned in, pretending to be secretive. "It's a highly classified operation, where you see who can eat the most pancakes without using their hands." Liam, who had been mostly quiet, looked up at her with suspicion. "That's not a real game." Evelyn gasped, feigning offense. "Oh really? Well, I guess you're scared you'd lose." Liam's little brows furrowed. "I would not lose." "Then prove it." And just like that, Liam, who had been pushing his food around for days, was eating. Emma was giggling uncontrollably, trying to take bites without touching the pancakes, syrup dripping down her chin. Evelyn's heart warmed. Then suddenly, "What the hell is going on?" Evelyn turned, startled as Alexander stood at the doorway, looking as if he had stepped into an alternate universe. His children, his serious, lonely children, were laughing. The mansion, always stiff and cold, was filled with the sound of joy. For a moment he looked lost. Good morning, Mr. Knight, Evelyn said smoothly, wiping syrup from Emma's cheek. Alexander's gaze flickered between them, then landed on Evelyn. Is this what I hired you for? To turn my house into a circus? Liam, usually quiet around his father, suddenly spoke. Evelyn's fun. You're just mad because you don't know how to have fun. The room went silent. Evelyn's breath caught. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a second something dark flashed in his eyes. Something like hurt. I have work to do, he said, his voice cold. Clean up when you're done. Then without another word, he left. Liam dropped his fork. I ruined it, didn't I? Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his. No, sweetheart, you just told the truth. A storm brewing between them. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself drawn to the balcony outside Alexander's study. She wasn't even sure why she was there. Maybe it was the way his face had hardened when Liam spoke, the way his shoulders had tensed, like a man carrying wounds he never allowed to heal. She found him standing there, staring out over the city skyline, a glass of whiskey in his hand. You left dinner early, she said softly. He exhaled, not looking at her. Didn't have much of an appetite. Evelyn hesitated before stepping closer. They need you, you know, Emma and Liam. They love you. Alexander let out a hollow chuckle. Love. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Love is messy. Love is unreliable. Love is. He trailed off. She tilted her head, studying him. What happened to you? His jaw clenched. I don't need a nanny psychoanalyzing me. I'm not psychoanalyzing, she countered. I'm just curious. He finally turned to her then, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the cold, calculated businessman. His eyes weren't just blue, they were stormy, filled with something he didn't want to name. My wife, he said finally, voice rough, was the love of my life, and she left me. Evelyn's breath hitched. Left, not died. He wasn't grieving her death. He was grieving her absence. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand, but instead she just whispered, I'm sorry. He held her gaze, the tension between them thick, suffocating. You should go inside, he said after a long pause. Before you get too close. His words weren't just about the cold night air. They were a warning that if she got too close to him, she might never be able to pull away. The almost kiss. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Alexander's words haunted her. Before you get too close. Was she getting too close? She was still lost in thought when she heard a noise outside her room. Curiosity tugging at her, she stepped out, only to find Alexander standing in the dimly lit hallway, running a hand through his hair, looking restless. He hadn't seen her yet. Something about the way he stood there, lost in thought, made her chest ache. He always carried himself like a man who had everything under control. But tonight, in this quiet moment, he looked like a man who didn't know what to do. She took a step forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath her, and his head snapped up. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then slowly, he stepped toward her, his gaze dark, intense. I told myself I wouldn't do this, he murmured, his voice deep and rough. Evelyn swallowed. Do what? His eyes flickered to her lips, and her breath hitched. This, he whispered. Then before she could process what was happening, his hand brushed against her cheek, his touch burning into her skin like fire. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She should step back, she should stop this, but she couldn't move, she couldn't breathe, she couldn't do anything but look into the eyes of the man who had everything, except love. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't the only one losing control. She was too. A forbidden pull. Evelyn stood frozen in the dim hallway, her breath shallow, her skin tingling where Alexander's fingers had barely grazed her cheek. The silence between them was thick, heavy with things unsaid, with emotions neither of them should have been feeling. For a long moment, he didn't move, neither did she. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, Alexander's jaw tightened, and he abruptly stepped back. This can't happen, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing herself to regain control of her racing heart. I know, and yet, neither of them moved to leave. His stormy blue eyes locked onto hers, something raw flickering in them. "You don't understand," he said, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "I don't do this. I don't let people in. I don't." Her hand moved before she could stop it, gently covering his. His breath hitched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. "Maybe that's the problem," she whispered. Something in him cracked. For a second, just a second, she saw it, the lonely man beneath the cold exterior, the one who had been abandoned by love, and had spent years convincing himself he didn't need it. His fingers curled around hers, his grip firm yet hesitant. Evelyn, her name on his lips, was a warning and a plea all at once. Before either of them could do something they might regret, a soft voice interrupted them. "Daddy." They both turned to see Emma standing in the hallway, her little hands rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Why are you and Evelyn awake?" Evelyn immediately let go of Alexander's hand, stepping back. Alexander's face hardened, but not in anger, more like he was trying to bury whatever had just happened between them. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than Evelyn had ever heard it. Emma pouted, then reached out for Evelyn. "Can Evelyn tuck me in?" Evelyn's heart melted. She glanced at Alexander, as if asking for permission. For a brief second, something unreadable passed through his eyes, but then he nodded. "Of course," Evelyn said, picking Emma up into her arms, the little girl resting her head on her shoulder. As she carried Emma away, she felt Alexander's gaze on her back, and she knew whatever this was between them, it wasn't over. The charity gala, a night of whispers and stolen glances. 2 days later, the entire mansion was buzzing with preparations for an exclusive charity gala, an event attended by New York's elite, and one where Alexander Knight was expected to make an appearance. Evelyn had no reason to be there, and yet, "I need you to accompany me tonight," Alexander said casually, not looking up from his laptop as they sat in his office. Evelyn blinked, thinking she had misheard him. "What?" His jaw clenched slightly. "Emma and Liam adore you. They've been happier since you arrived. The media will be watching, and it would be good for my image if they saw my children comfortable with their nanny." Right. Of course, it was about image, not about the way his fingers had curled around hers that night, not about the way he had almost kissed her. She forced herself to nod. "All right. Good," he exhaled, looking relieved. "I'll have a dress sent to your room." That evening, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, in a gown unlike anything she had ever worn before. It was a deep sapphire blue, shimmering under the soft lights of her room. The fabric hugged her figure perfectly, flowing down to the floor in elegant waves. She barely recognized herself. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Alexander stepped inside. The moment his eyes landed on her, he stopped. For a long second, he just looked at her. A slow, unreadable expression crossed his face. Something like surprise, something like admiration, something like desire. Evelyn's heart stuttered. "You look." His voice was husky. He cleared his throat. "Beautiful." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Thank you." A strange tension settled between them, thick and undeniable. Then Alexander offered his arm. "Shall we?" She hesitated for only a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his arm, and together they walked out into the night, dancing with fire. The gala was grand, chandeliers casting a golden glow over the room, laughter and music filling the air. But Evelyn only noticed him. Alexander was effortless in this world, commanding the room with his presence, shaking hands with powerful figures, making polite conversation. But every now and then, his eyes would find hers across the crowd, and each time, her breath caught. It was dangerous, the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the room worth noticing. The moment came when the music changed, a soft melody playing through the speakers. Couples moved to the dance floor, and before Evelyn could react, Alexander was in front of her. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Her heart pounded as she placed her hand in his. He led her to the dance floor, one arm wrapping around her waist, the other holding her hand firmly in his.
As they moved, Evelyn could feel the heat of his touch, the strength in his grip. She could smell him, rich cologne, and something uniquely him. "You've been avoiding me," he murmured, his lips dangerously close to her ear. She shivered. "I haven't, you have," he countered, "and I want to know why." Her throat was dry. Because you make my heart race. Because I think about you more than I should. Because I'm scared I might be falling for a man who doesn't believe in love." She looked up at him, and the way he was staring at her, like she was something forbidden, something irresistible, made her entire body tingle. His grip on her waist tightened. "Evelyn," her name was a whisper on his lips, and then a voice interrupted them. Well, isn't this a surprise?" Alexander stiffened. Evelyn turned, only to see a stunning blonde woman standing there, smirking at them. There was something familiar about her. Then it hit her. This was her, the woman who had left him, Alexander's ex-wife. And just like that, the moment between them shattered. Evelyn felt it, felt him pull away, felt the warmth between them turn cold. But not before she saw the flicker of something in his eye. Pain, heartbreak, something told her this night was about to change everything. The ghost of his past. Evelyn felt the shift instantly. 1 second, Alexander had been holding her close, his grip firm yet tender, his gaze burning into hers with an intensity that stole her breath. And then her, the stunning blonde woman standing before them, with a smirk that spoke of familiarity, of history, of power. Alexander's entire body went rigid. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitched, like he wanted to hold on but knew he couldn't. Evelyn didn't have to ask to know who she was. Scarlett Monroe, the woman who had once been the love of his life, the mother of his children, the one who had walked away, and she was looking at Evelyn like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Well, Alex, this is unexpected," Scarlett said, her voice laced with amusement. "I never thought I'd see you so comfortable in another woman's arms." Alexander's grip on Evelyn's waist loosened, and the absence of his warmth was colder than it should have been. "This isn't the place, Scarlett," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. Scarlett laughed, tilting her head. "Oh, but it is. You're dancing with the nanny, and the whole room is watching. I can already see the headlines." Her eyes flickered to Evelyn. "Tell me, sweetheart, is this how you landed the job, or are you just that charming?" Evelyn felt her stomach twist, but she kept her expression steady. She knew women like Scarlett, polished, powerful, beautiful, and dangerous in the way they could make you feel like you didn't belong with just a single glance. Before she could respond, Alexander spoke, his tone colder than Evelyn had ever heard. "Enough." The sharpness in his voice made Scarlett's smirk falter for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Relax, darling. I just wanted to say hello." She turned her gaze back to Evelyn, this time more calculating. "You must be something special. He doesn't let people in easily."
Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to deny it, wanted to say it wasn't like that. But the truth was, she didn't know what they were anymore. Scarlett sighed dramatically. "Well, I should be going. But Alex," her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, "we should talk soon, about the kids. And other things." Alexander didn't respond. Scarlett turned, her silk dress swishing as she disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a silence that felt like a wound. Evelyn exhaled, forcing herself to meet Alexander's gaze, but his expression was unreadable, guarded, distant, and she hated that it hurt. Shattered moments. The ride home was quiet. Too quiet. Alexander sat beside her in the car, his hands clenched into fists, his gaze fixed out the window. The weight of Scarlett's presence still lingered between them, thick and suffocating. Evelyn knew she shouldn't ask. She knew it wasn't her place, but the words slipped out anyway. "Are you okay?" A muscle in his jaw ticked. He didn't look at her. "I don't know." The honesty in his voice startled her. She hesitated, then softly said, "She still has a hold on you." Alexander finally turned, his blue eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. "She doesn't." Evelyn swallowed. Then why do you look like you just saw a ghost? His gaze locked onto hers, searching almost as if he was trying to decide how much to say. Finally he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because she knows exactly how to get under my skin, and because for years I let her. Evelyn's heart ached for him. She hurt you. A bitter laugh escaped him. She destroyed me. The rawness in his voice made Evelyn reach for his hand before she could stop herself. His fingers stiffened beneath hers, but he didn't pull away. For a moment neither of them spoke, then his thumb brushed lightly against her palm, a barely there touch that sent a shiver down her spine. And just like that, something shifted, the distance, the hesitation, it all blurred, drowned by the unspoken pull between them. Evelyn's lips parted, but before she could say anything, the car slowed, pulling into the night estate. Reality came crashing back. Alexander let go first. The absence of his touch was like cold air against her skin. "We should get inside," he said, his voice unreadable. And just like that, the moment was gone. A long night of hidden longings. Evelyn tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her mind replayed everything. Scarlett's words, the way Alexander had pulled away, the way he had held her hand like he didn't want to let go. She hated this. She hated that she felt this much. With a frustrated sigh, she wrapped herself in a robe and quietly stepped out of her room, hoping that maybe a cup of tea would help. She wasn't expecting to find Alexander already in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, dressed in sweatpants and a loose shirt, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired, more than she had ever seen him. For a moment she just watched him. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned, his eyes met hers, and something flickered there, something deep, something dangerous. Neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Alexander set down his glass. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Evelyn shook her head. A long silence stretched between them. Then he took a step closer, and another. Her breath caught. "I don't know what's happening between us," he murmured, his voice rough, uncertain. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Neither do I." His fingers brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. She should step back. She should say something logical, but she didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, Alexander wasn't hiding. He was just a man, a broken, beautiful man, who was looking at her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. And God help her, she wanted to catch him. A night of confessions. Evelyn stood there, her breath shallow, as Alexander's fingers brushed against hers. The kitchen was dimly lit, the faint glow from the chandelier casting soft shadows across his face. He looked different, not the cold, untouchable businessman she had first met, but a man standing on the edge of something dangerous. "I should go back to my room," Evelyn whispered, though she made no move to step away. Alexander's eyes darkened. "Do you want to?" Her heart pounded. She should say yes. She should break the spell between them, before it became something she couldn't control. But instead, she found herself whispering, "No." A sharp breath escaped him. His fingers curled gently around her wrist, his touch burning against her skin. "Evelyn," his voice was a plea, a warning, a confession. And then he did something she never expected. He let go. He took a step back, running a hand through his already tousled hair, exhaling like he was fighting a battle within himself. "I can't." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Why?" Alexander let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Because I'm already falling for you, and I don't know if I can stop." Her breath hitched. He looked at her, then his blue eyes burning with emotions he had tried so hard to suppress. "I don't do this, Evelyn. I don't get attached. I don't let myself feel." He clenched his fists. "But you're making it impossible." Evelyn's heart swelled with emotions so intense, so overwhelming, that they scared her. "You think you're the only one," she whispered. Alexander stiffened. "I feel it too," she admitted, stepping closer, her voice trembling with raw honesty. "Every time you walk into a room, I feel it. Every time you look at me, I feel it. And every time you pull away, It hurts. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. Alexander's jaw tightened. Then we're both fools. Evelyn swallowed past the lump in her throat. Maybe. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Alexander exhaled, his expression tortured. Go to bed, Evelyn. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. Evelyn hesitated, for only a moment before nodding, her heart aching as she turned and walked away, leaving behind a man who was just as lost as she was. A distant morning. The next morning was different, colder. Alexander barely spoke to her. He busied himself with work, his phone pressed to his ear, his posture stiff. Evelyn tried to act normal, but every time she caught his gaze, her stomach twisted. The children, however, were completely oblivious to the storm raging between the adults. Miss Evelyn, come have breakfast with us, Emma beamed, patting the seat next to her. Evelyn smiled, grateful for the distraction. Of course, sweetheart. She sat down, helping Emma with her cereal, while little Liam attempted to stack pancakes like building blocks. Alexander, who usually sat at the head of the table, was nowhere to be seen. Evelyn forced herself to focus, but a part of her felt hollow, and when she caught Alexander sneaking a glance at her from across the room, his expression unreadable, she realized something. This wasn't over, not even close. The unexpected guest. That afternoon, the mansion was quieter than usual. Alexander had left for a meeting, and the kids were down for a nap. Evelyn took the opportunity to step out into the garden, letting the crisp air calm the storm inside her. But just as she was about to head back inside, she heard a voice, a familiar, unwelcome voice. Well, well, if it isn't the help. Evelyn's spine stiffened. She turned and there stood Scarlett Monroe. The woman was dressed in a designer dress, sunglasses perched atop her perfect blonde waves, a smirk playing on her lips. Evelyn took a steady breath. Can I help you with something? Scarlett let out a soft laugh, stepping closer. You're bold, I'll give you that. Evelyn didn't respond. She just stood her ground. Scarlett's smirk deepened. You think you're special, don't you? She tilted her head. That just because Alexander lets you play house with his kids, you mean something to him. Evelyn clenched her fists, her pulse quickening. Scarlett leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Let me tell you a little secret, sweetheart. Men like Alexander, they don't fall for women like you. Evelyn's breath caught. He'll get bored, Scarlett continued, her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. And when he does, you'll be nothing more than a mistake he regrets. Evelyn swallowed hard, her chest tightening, but she refused to let Scarlett see her break. With a calm she didn't quite feel, she looked the woman straight in the eye. You walked away from him, didn't you? Scarlett's smirk faltered. Evelyn took a step closer. So tell me, why does it bother you so much that I'm here? Scarlett's jaw clenched, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Scarlett. Both women turned, only to find Alexander standing at the entrance, his expression thunderous. Scarlett flipped her hair, regaining her composure instantly. Oh darling, I was just having a little chat with your nanny. Alexander's gaze flickered to Evelyn, before landing back on Scarlett. We both know you're not here for the kids, so why are you here? Scarlett's lips curled into a smile. Can't a woman visit the father of her children? Alexander's jaw tightened. Not when she has ulterior motives. Scarlett sighed, stepping closer to him.
You used to love me, Alex.
Evelyn's heart clenched. Alexander didn't even flinch. You used to be someone worth loving. Scarlett's smile finally faltered, and Evelyn, she felt a rush of something she couldn't name, because in that moment, she saw it. The past didn't own Alexander anymore, and maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them after all. A storm brewing after Scarlett left. The mansion felt heavier, like her presence had left an invisible stain in the air. Evelyn didn't know what to say, and Alexander, standing rigid by the entrance, looked like a man who had just walked through fire.
But it wasn't Scarlett's words that it was Evelyn. Because the moment he had seen Scarlett trying to manipulate Evelyn, a sharp realization had struck him. He wasn't afraid of Scarlett anymore. He was afraid of Evelyn, of what she made him feel, of how badly he wanted her. Evelyn took a steady breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Alexander looked at her then, his blue eyes stormy, with emotions he couldn't name. "You didn't have to defend me," she continued, her fingers clutching the hem of her dress. "I can handle myself." A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips. "I know you can." Their eyes locked, the air between them felt thick, charged with something neither of them dared to touch. Then suddenly Alexander turned away. "I have work to do." His voice was clipped, cold, a wall slammed between them, and just like that, he was gone, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the fading sunlight, wondering if she had just imagined the warmth in his eyes. Unfinished conversations. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Alexander's voice echoing in her mind. "I'm already falling for you, and I don't know if I can stop." But he had stopped, or at least he was trying to. She didn't know if that hurt more than never hearing those words at all. Sighing, she sat up and pulled on a robe. Maybe some fresh air would help clear her head. She stepped out into the hallway, her bare feet padding softly against the marble floor. The mansion was silent, except for the faint sound of wind rattling against the windows. But just as she reached the staircase, she heard something, a deep, familiar voice. Alexander. He was on the phone, his back turned to her as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. "Yes, I understand," he was saying, his tone sharp, businesslike. "I'll handle it." There was a pause, then his voice dropped, lower, tighter. "She came back today." Evelyn's heart clenched, a beat of silence. Then, "No, I don't love Scarlett. I never did." Evelyn's breath hitched. She should leave. She shouldn't be standing there, listening. But she couldn't move, because what he said next shattered her completely. "There's someone else." Evelyn's pulse pounded. She didn't hear the rest, didn't need to. She turned and rushed back to her room, her heart racing. Someone else. Could he have meant? No. She couldn't let herself hope. Not when he was still pushing her away. Not when she didn't know if he'd ever stop. An inevitable collision. The next day, the tension between them was suffocating. Alexander avoided her. Evelyn tried to act normal. The kids, as always, were the only source of light in the house. "Miss Evelyn, can we go to the park today?" Emma asked excitedly at breakfast. "Daddy, can you come too?" Evelyn froze. She hadn't spoken to Alexander since overhearing his phone call. Alexander hesitated, then sighed. "I have meetings." Emma pouted. "You always have meetings." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. Evelyn saw the struggle in his eyes, and before she could stop herself, she said, "Maybe just for a little while." Their gazes met. For a long, aching moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Alexander exhaled. "Fine, but only an hour." Emma cheered. Evelyn, she didn't know what she had just gotten herself into. The park, and a moment too real. The afternoon sun was warm, and the park was alive with laughter. Emma and Liam ran ahead, chasing each other around the swings. Evelyn and Alexander sat on a bench, side by side, their shoulders almost touching. Neither spoke for a long time. Then, Alexander broke the silence. "I heard you last night." Evelyn's breath caught. He turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "You were standing outside my study, weren't you?" She swallowed hard. "I wasn't lying," he interrupted, his voice raw. "About Scarlett, about not loving her." Evelyn gripped the fabric of her dress. "And the other thing," she whispered. Alexander's jaw clenched. "You said there's someone else," she continued, her voice trembling. "Did you mean?" "Yes." A single word, a single admission. Evelyn's lips parted, her heart hammering. Alexander exhaled, running a hand down his face. "You drive me insane, Evelyn." His voice was hoarse. "I try to stay away, and then you." He gestured toward her, frustration and longing mixing in his eyes. "You smile, or laugh or look at me like you did just now, and I can't. Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight. Tell me to stop, he murmured, leaning in slightly. Tell me to let you go. Evelyn's breath shuddered. She should say yes. She should, but instead she whispered, I can't. A groan escaped Alexander's lips, and before she could process what was happening, his hand was in her hair, pulling her closer, his breath warm against her skin. Evelyn, he murmured, his voice laced with need. And then a shriek of laughter broke the moment. Emma and Liam came running toward them, giggling as they tackled Evelyn, in a playful hug. She let out a breathless laugh, shaking off the heat of the moment, while Alexander pulled back, running a hand through his hair. The moment was over, but the fire still burned, and Evelyn knew there was no going back now. A night of restless thoughts. Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still pounding from what had almost happened at the park. Alexander had almost kissed her. No, he would have kissed her, if the kids hadn't interrupted. But what shook her the most wasn't the near kiss, it was what he had said. You drive me insane. Tell me to stop, tell me to let you go. And she hadn't. She couldn't. Evelyn touched her lips, as if they still burned from the closeness of his. A part of her wanted to believe that Alexander's feelings were real, that he wasn't just caught in the heat of the moment. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt before, was afraid. What if she let herself fall, only for him to walk away? What if she was just a passing moment in his life, a fleeting desire, torn between her emotions and her fears? Evelyn knew one thing. She needed to keep her heart safe. Avoidance and longing. The next morning, Evelyn decided to keep her distance. She focused on Emma and Liam, avoiding unnecessary interactions with Alexander. If he entered the room, she busied herself elsewhere. If he looked at her, she pretended not to notice. But he noticed, and it infuriated him. By midday, Alexander had had enough. Evelyn was helping Emma with an art project in the living room when Alexander walked in. He didn't say a word, but Evelyn felt his gaze burning into her. Miss Evelyn, will you get me more colors? Emma asked. Evelyn nodded quickly, grateful for the excuse to escape. But as soon as she stepped out of the room, Alexander was there, blocking her path. She inhaled sharply. Excuse me. He didn't move. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unreadable. Are you avoiding me? Evelyn's pulse jumped. No. His lips twitched. Liar. She folded her arms. I don't know what you mean. Alexander took a step closer, his voice lower now. You haven't looked at me all day. You barely say 2 words to me. Evelyn swallowed. I'm just focused on my work. His eyes darkened. Is that what you call it? Silence stretched between them. The air felt charged, like something was about to snap. Then Alexander did something that made Evelyn's breath hitch. He reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered shut for a second at the warmth of his touch. I meant what I said, he murmured. Evelyn opened her eyes, her heart pounding. Which part? His jaw clenched. All of it. The intensity in his gaze made her knees weak. Evelyn knew she should push him away, but instead she whispered, Then why are you still holding back? Alexander exhaled sharply. Because you deserve more than what I can give you. Her throat tightened. What does that mean? He took another step, his voice raw. It means I'm not the kind of man who knows how to love properly. I don't know how to be soft, how to be vulnerable. His hands curled into fists at his sides. But with you, I want to try. Evelyn's breath caught. This was real. Not just attraction, not just desire. Something deeper, something terrifying. And in that moment, standing inches apart, she knew there was no running anymore. The first kiss that evening, after putting the kids to bed, Evelyn stepped out onto the balcony for some air. The night was cool, the stars twinkling above like tiny diamonds. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and then she felt him, Alexander. He didn't speak, he simply stood behind her, his presence overwhelming. For a long moment, they just stood there, neither saying a word. Then softly, he murmured, Turn around. Evelyn hesitated. but she turned. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something in Alexander shattered. He couldn't fight it anymore. With a low, desperate groan, he reached for her, cupping her face between his hands. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it was fierce, consuming. Years of loneliness, months of tension, weeks of longing poured into one breathtaking moment. Evelyn gasped against his lips, but she didn't pull away. She melted into him. Her fingers found his shirt, gripping the fabric as if she was afraid he'd disappear. Alexander growled, deepening the kiss, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her even closer. Time didn't exist, nothing existed, except them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, foreheads resting against each other. Alexander's voice was hoarse. "Tell me this isn't just in my head." Evelyn reached up, gently tracing his jawline. "It's not." His grip on her tightened. "Then don't run from me." She smiled softly. "Only if you promise not to push me away." A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "Deal." And this time when he kissed her, it was slow, deep, and filled with a promise neither of them could take back.